I'm Randy Chase. This is at the Friar's Table, and we're recording it for the very first time from the Friar's Table restaurant. And I'm with brother Phil Bernier. And Bernier,
Yes.
you're one of the folks involved in the restaurant,
Yes.
and you are a Capuchin.
Capuchin, just like the monkey, Capuchin friar.
Which is from the Franciscan order.
Yes, we are one of the primary branches of the male Franciscan communities. There are 4 principal communities. Our community was founded in the 1520s in Italy, and then middle of the Counter-Reformation of it. We were founded almost the same time as the Jesuits. And our name comes from our hood, which is a capuche. So we had a long hood that we believe St. Francis might have worn if you're looking at old frescoes.
Francis goes all the way back to the 1100s.
Yeah, he was born in 1181. I think he died in 1226.
Wow.
So a very
Short life.
Short life. He was never probably in the best of health. He was at one point in his time was a prisoner of war. So after that period, he suffered like what we would call post-traumatic stress syndrome after that year in captivity. The end of his life, he bore the wounds of Christ. They call the stigmata. He wore the 5 wounds of Christ on his body physically. So it was bleeding.
What are the 5? Where are the 5?
Both hands, both feet, and in the side, where the soldier's lance pierced him on the cross. Yeah. So he bore those wounds. He was the first person that we knew that's documented that bore them, and his desire to conform himself totally to Christ and to Christ crucified. So he actually bore the wounds for 2 years and suffered as a result of that. So he was physically not a big man, but suffered mentally and physically throughout his life. But that didn't rob him of his joy. And that's the beauty of Francis, is that he suffered much, but his joys were ecstatic.
He has quite a few labels, from both Catholics and non-Catholics, and I didn't know this until doing a little research for our conversation, but there are friars are Catholics and non-Catholics. Because that I'm a Catholic Protestant.
Yes, you're blending both worlds.
I am, and it's a beautiful thing because I have discovered, that I sort of grew up in and around the Catholic Church, but without a family guide, so to speak. I just drifted in and out by my own accord, and then the Protestants reeled me in, and I felt the love of God for the first time. And I have such incredible, beautiful relationships in that church. But I've always missed the Catholic Church. And then I met you very randomly. And I'll just say, I came to St. Peter, where you're pastor, and for a wedding for my niece. And so I came up and said hello and shook your hand and said thank you. And then I was in the midst of doing Ignatian exercises. And on the very last day, in colloquy with the Holy Spirit, I'm told that I need to reach out to you. And it was about 3 weeks after I met you. And it was so random. And so I reached out to you, and we had lunch here, and everything, kind of worked out. When I was driving here, I said, "Oh, we need to do a show."
And I think I'm a friar because of a random encounter. And it was just someone, I met someone in an evening, and we talked a little bit and went to the Catholic card to see what's going on. I really wasn't connected fully to a church at that time. And he said, I go to St. Paul's Shrine downtown. and we'd love to have you because we're a small congregation. St. Paul's is at 40th and Euclid, and it's an old church, small church, and he knew I had church background. Well, we love to have you join our congregation. It was totally random. And I met the priest, and about a month later, the priest said, "We ever thought about being a priest?" And I said, no, no, it's not on the cards right now. And he said, "Well, think about it." And it was just this whole a random event with ultimately a stranger led to someone membership back in the church, meeting with a priest friar who showed me a different way of being a priest. I knew diocesan priests, but I knew nothing about friars. And Father John invited me in a way I'd never been invited in before, and he gave me that opportunity to ask a question in myself I needed to answer. So I mean, some of the random events in life are incredibly life shaping, life forming.
And not really very random. They end up feeling like God's providence, you know?
At the moment, and just right trying to see the plan of it all. For the moment, it's just always being attentive to the moment of what's happening and the people we're encountering and where they can lead us.
What year was that you came to be a friar? 90s?
I would say Paul's about 1990. I entered formation as the process of becoming a friar. And then this goes to various stages, graduate studies at Catholic University, process of taking vows. We take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, first temporary for a period of 3 years. And then after that, a little more prayer and discernment to commit fully the rest of my life as a friar, like our own vows, our own commitments.
I mean, you know, committing to God for the rest of our lives is sort of the point of being here in my estimation. After having been a bit of a wild person and in a chaotic life for a very long time, you know. Um, so I so I've come to St. Peter where you have mass, where you give mass, and I found it to be really incredible. Um, we come up to the altar and stand around when you prepare the Eucharist, and I never did that before,
Right.
but it's the coolest thing. I'm gonna tell you, this past Christmas, we were standing around the altar, and I felt like the cathedral was filled with angels. Like, there was this strange pressure coming from the ceiling, where the ceiling was not as high as it is because it was filled with angels, and I was it was a very odd, moment, and I could kind of feel well, no, I could feel Jesus's presence standing, um, to your left at the altar, which, put you at his right hand, which this was a period of time that I thought about it, but I just thought there was something so strange at that moment, and I remember looking up and thinking, "Boy, this it's crowded in here."
Well, it was crowded in there, which was very nice crowd. But I'm going to do Angels Christmas night is the night to be filled with angels. But it's just St. Peter's because it has had a troubled history. It was closed for a few years, and it has reopened. But a pastor um, designed the space with a vision of, and I think it's true that the space forms a community that worships in the space. So the church itself forms a community. St. Peter's, the chairs facing one another with wonderfully light, bright
Yeah.
stained glass that just fills the place with light on a sunny day. And facing one another is very monastic. So it builds community in a very unique way when you're facing one another. The point where some people feel uncomfortable. They do not like that. It's called oppositional seating, and they don't care for it at all, but it's for us, it's much more comfortable. Friars amongst those who pray in the common, um, and then to move from the place where we hear the word into the sanctuary for the Eucharist.
And you're smack dab in the middle of the biggest homelessness in the city. You know, when I was at church one day, a homeless man came in and you folks gave him a bag of stuff and I thought, "Oh, well that's awesome," because it's a lot of folks don't know what to do with the homeless.
It's not blaming for the situations that are there, 'cause the situations are very challenging, and you're there for the grace of God, go all of us. It'd be very possible for many of us to be on the street. Um, like last night, we had, in one room, we had a young adult Bible study going on. And in the room I was in, I was working with a couple doing marriage preparation. And right through the middle of the doors walked two guys. They saw our door was open. Can we sleep here tonight? I said, I can't let you do that.
Yeah,
I can get you something, but I can't leave you in the building overnight.
right.
When we were challenged by a homeless camp in front of the Cosgrove Center, it became a real mess with drugs and prostitution and the whole thing going on. The One of the homeless advocates reminded us they're here because they feel safe. They feel safe in this space between Cosgrove and the church. The original people who were homeless and came in and camped, um, is you should feel fortunate in a way because they're here because there's a comfort level, and that comfort level is safety is from Cosgrove, the Catholic Charities building, and from the church.
Yeah,
And ultimately, we've not had any significant issues. We've had
right.
some interesting people come in and add some flavor to the mass of what was going on. But all in all, it's a process of getting most of our parishioners come from the suburbs, way out of the suburbs, and it's how to draw them into participating and helping with the poor without being afraid, without casting judgment. And just I now watch they grab those bags. Oh, Father, there's somebody here at the door. Well, you know where they are. You get them, and you hand them out and take care of that as best we can.
I had, my time when I really wasn't I didn't wanna be bothered by the homeless people. I don't wanna be approached, and I would be very matter of fact, like, "You don't I don't have anything for you, back up, I don't wanna be bothered." And, after I became a Christian man, like, officially, God started to work on that. I, had this homeless man that used to sort of be walking by my business, and I would say hello. Yeah. He would say hello to me. I'd say hello to him. I saw him a couple of times. And then I remember one Christmas being at home, horrible snowstorm, and I remember literally just crying, thinking about that poor man being out on the street. And it was like so uncharacteristic of who I was that I was a little taken aback by it. And uh, just it's sort of a long story, but I'll keep it brief. But I didn't see him for several months, and I was thinking about him a lot. And one day I was sitting in my car talking on the phone, and he was walking by, and I rolled down my window and I said, "Hey," and he comes over, and I talked to him, and he said, "You should come and visit me at the homeless shelter." And I said, "Okay, I guess I could do that." I just had his first name, and I went in the office and I called the homeless shelter and I said, "This is so crazy because it's like," I said, "What time are visiting hours?" And they said, "Sir, this is a homeless shelter. People come here to sleep and eat. We don't have visiting hours." And I was like, "Well, how would I get in touch with a gentleman over there?" You just have to find him on the street, or you could volunteer. And I said, "Okay, well, what would that entail?" I mean, you have to talk to, you know, the person in charge of that. And I had had this run-in with the name Lydia 5 days in a row right before that. And it's, the Christian convert. I had a dream about it. It was in a podcast. I sat down at church and I introduced myself to the young lady next to me, and her name was Lydia. And I'm on this call about at the home with the homeless shelter, and they said you could volunteer. And I said, okay, well, who would I talk to about that? They said Lydia Bailey. And so I was just floored by that because that was all in the span of a week. It was all Lydia all the time. And so um I managed the computer room over there, and then the pandemic came. And then after the pandemic, Lydia let me do a Bible study. And it was mostly me and one or two or three guys with masks on. And I sat across the table from homeless men crying with them. And my whole thing has been changed, about how I feel. I'm not afraid of them. I have compassion, and I worry about their lives now, as opposed to I don't want to be bothered by you.
And so much of that is encounter, and be willing to encounter, and the power of a name. I found very much asking the person, like in a conversation, just very simply, "What is your name?" And that, offers the other person a moment of dignity. Yeah, so that they're each person, then they wanna know my name. We had a gentleman, came for 20 years, named Eugene Bell, and he came to our back door so often. There were times we get him inside in the winter to give him a place at a building we had on property, but Eugene was a fixture, and so many of at St. Paul's, not so much as St. Peter's, but at St. Paul's, uh, the homeless people in the community became fixtures. We knew them by name, and they were very regular people around the property, and, uh, that was an opportunity to, work with them and just to gain just that sense of comfort. And the people, because I tell our parishioners, um, they're the homeless in our area are that's where they live. That's their home. And our parishioners are coming in from the suburbs into their neighborhood, into their community. So actually our parishioners are visitors in the midst, and the homeless and around St. Peter's and Cosgrove and the county welfare building and all of those they're the residents. And our parishioners are the visitors and coming in, and how can we be present to them without enabling? There are other ways to do things, like our young adults have, subway cards. They keep subway cards in their wallets.
Okay, there's a Subway across.
Across the street, and there's Dunkin' right across the street here. Keep it, and somebody comes to ask for something, they'll give them the card. We give the bag, the care, share the care bags with all kinds of, food and water, and depending on who puts them together, gloves, hats, whatever people can imagine would be helpful. So it's where can you find your level of comfort assisting the poor who come to you, where I don't feel I'm enabling something. I want to be able to empower them some way. That they can make their own choices. They can get their own food. They don't have to be, begging at least for a dinner. And it's how we can't solve the problem, but how can you be present to it?
And so it took God to hit me over the head with it.
Mhm.
Even though I had seen homeless folks a million times, because I lived downtown for a
Sure.
number of years.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm ashamed of the past, but I'm hopeful about the future,
Right. Right.
and I'm grateful and thankful to God for opening my eyes and not letting them be the wrong kind of fixture.
Mhm.
Because things can be a fixture where you just don't even notice them anymore.
Exactly. And it's very, very easy for the poor to become invisible. Then we don't see them anymore, and they're just not part of our vision. Or I move out to an exurb because I don't want to see it anymore. I don't want to deal with it anymore. If I move away, and it's a challenge. But so many of the saints, in their stories have these moments of encountering the poor. St. Francis, his encounter with a leper, where he was the dandy young man, the great party boy of Assisi, and yet he was terrified of leprosy,
Right.
which is a normal medieval experience.
Right.
And while part of his conversion was on the road encountering the leper, and rather than running from the leper, embracing the leper. And so many of the stories always, when you embrace that which you fear, you embrace Christ. St. Martin of Tours was a centurion, Roman centurion, in a cold winter night. I encountered a poor man on the side of the road from his horse. The story is he cut his cloak in half and gave half of his centurion's cloak to the poor man to warm himself in the winter. And that poor man was Christ, which led to Martin's conversion and into becoming a bishop and the first saint of the church who was not a martyr, a prominent saint. In Europe, Saint Martin is everywhere.
Right. And what is the scripture, Lord, Lord, he says, when Christ says, I never knew you because you didn't do
Even
those, what,
the hungry, the thirsty, that you didn't clothe the naked, you didn't visit me in prison, you didn't care of me, and Matthew 25, and that's
right.
just the goats and the sheep and the goats, and the end times.
Yeah.
And how did this community experience the end time was finding Christ present in the people in the society. It would be challenging. And to be able to see the face of Christ in the poor, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the prisoner, the sick, to see Christ. And when we can see Christ, then you can embrace it. But it's that willingness to be able to see and to see past the surface and to see someone else who is given the dignity of being a brother or sister. And that's the challenge. And it's a challenge that, again, society is trying to back away from. Many of our policies and our procedures and the way that we are looking through our politic is sometimes uh, informing our faith rather than our faith informing our politics and how we see society at large. And it's just tough. It's a very difficult call.
It is.
And it's always like when Francis embraced the leper, that was the beginning of a conversion. When Martin gave his cloak to the poor man, it was the beginning of it. And conversion is not, I think some people, they can name the time, the moment, the place, what happened, but that's just the beginning. And conversion, we're constantly being converted until to the Lord embraces us. We call it, Franciscans call it sister death. And sister death embraces us and leads us over the waters of death to the kingdom. But this process of conversion is constantly at work in our lives and our openness to that process. As I talked about Beatitudes on Sunday, it was like, how is it, what's the Beatitude that can affect us so often is, as I said, number 4, hungering and thirsting for righteousness. That so it doesn't say blessed this, but no, the process of conversion is that hungering for righteousness, we will be able to become and live the virtues of the Beatitudes through our desire to be converted, our desire for righteousness and holiness.
We're definitely called to sort of surrender our,
Mhm.
they're almost like reverse inhibitions. Like we're inhibited by our own self-righteousness.
Yeah, but I think that's the whole process of the working of grace. We're all saved by grace. Well, unfortunately, we always believe that, along with the Catholics and Protestants, always believe that. We're all justified by grace. We couldn't speak to it in the Reformation because all the other issues that were on about the Reformation had nothing to do with religion. But it's that whole thing, we're all justified by grace.
Yeah.
And that justification flows out in the goodness of our lives and the works that we share. But it's for grace first. Our relationship is always God initiates and we cooperate. God is the beginning of all that we do, is the beginning and the end of everything. And yet that grace allows us to cooperate with God's plan for us. And that our cooperation is also a habit, that we have habits of not cooperating, but learning how to consistently surrender pour ourselves out and be open to the grace that allows us to enter deeper into relationship. Um, that's always the cooperation that God asks of us.
I don't think the divide between Catholics and Protestants is nearly what some people make it out to be, because I don't know any Protestants who don't believe that works are important.
It's this constant misunderstanding and interpretation of scripture,
I see the arguments online about it, and it's just like, nah.
and that we don't do scripture. We rely on sacraments, rely on this, rely on the saints, but everything we do at our core is drawn from the scriptures. And then the scripture becomes itself a tradition. And then this whole process of interpreting and living and reading. And I think Catholics feel intimidated sometimes by um, evangelical Protestants or Protestants in general who can quote chapter and verse. And that intimidates because, oh, I don't know it that way. But conversely, because of the way we read scriptures constantly in church, that Catholics know much more of the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
That they know they know very well the big picture of what goes on. And places where it comes, they can't often quote the epistles, whether the chapter and verse of the epistles, but fully formed in the gospel. And I think
Yeah.
more than they realize.
I've carried all of my Catholic, all of my knowledge or the things I've learned from being a Catholic over the years, I've brought it all into Protestantism. You know, when I pray to the Holy Spirit, I say, "You are the maker. You're the Lord, the giver of life, who comes from my Father and the Son, and I glorify you, just like I glorify them." No.
Well, they are one. And then you pull that together.
But those are the beautiful things that Catholics are really entrenched in, and it's good, you know?
But yeah, I think the, when you have either extreme, that they don't understand. When you get it in the middle, uh, most Catholics, Protestants, we're fine. We're all trying to do the right thing, and we're all trying to do it together. And we just understand it in different traditions, different practices.
I would love to see a more unified relationship between Catholics and Protestants, just like the one that happened between the Orthodox and the Catholics, that we had the Pope with who's the head of the Orthodox Church.
The Patriarch of Constantinople,
Right.
first among equals, but that desire to end 1,000 years of separation, 1,000 years of division, and just to be able to and recognize the power of the Eucharist, the power of communion that ultimately calls us together and brings us together and allows us to share the fullness of Christ, and how that must lead to reconciliation.
That's why I'm excited to be a Catholic Protestant, because there's so much love for me to receive from both, you know? But I know that when I first felt the love of God, it was it was the it was the linchpin for everything. It was the beginning of the journey.
Yeah.
When I look back through my life, I could see all the times that God was there now that I couldn't see him then.
I would say so you can see God better in the rearview mirror than you can looking through the front. You know, like through the windshield, you just don't even know what's there. But just looking back in the rearview mirror to see where you've been is how we find where God is walking
Yeah.
with us and guiding us. And it gives, I think, more confidence to look to the future and say, God's been with me, God is with me, and God will continue to be with me.
Yeah.
And that deepens the faith and the trust that we can acknowledge.
We were talking about the homelessness and St. Peter and being smack dab in the middle of it. Well, this restaurant that we're filming in today is the Friar's Table,
Right.
and you're involved in it with Brandon Krastowski,
Right.
who many people know as a philanthropist, uh,
Visionary.
restaurateur, visionary. You and he came together on this?
We're in a place where three nonprofits come together.
Nice.
As Cleveland Cavalier Ministries, which is a nonprofit. Playhouse Square. Playhouse Square is our landlord.
Mm.
They are a nonprofit.
Oh,
And Edwin's Leadership Academy is a nonprofit. And first conversation I had with Brandon was, I love what you do, and I'd love to see what we might be able to do together. I was thinking something very small. Uh, Not this. No, no. I was something like a coffee shop, a bakery, a little sandwich shop, something on the corner. And Brandon said, "Oh, don't waste your time. Do something big, and I'll help you do it."
nice. And so the food, tell me about the food here.
Simple, uh, monastic. Cuisine would be not some of you might find in our friaries or you might find in a monastery. Soups, salads, uh, not a whole lot of emphasis on red meat, um, but something that would be simple, uh, wholesome, healthy, and practical because we're in a theater district. All of our religions have centered on the power and the gift of food to build community, and that's where the hope here is a community can be formed here around a table, and that table is um, tended to by many people who have had challenges in their past. Maybe they're incarcerated, maybe they're a refugee or an immigrant, maybe living in public housing. There's something challenges that everybody here has a story, including the friar. Everybody has a story,
Right.
and it's how do we allow those stories to be granted a new opportunity and a place.
To be lifted up.
Exactly. It's the opportunity of allowing people to come in and share um, a Franciscan gift. This is certainly ministry, and we are Francis desired that we be people of reconciliation. That he went and he himself visited the Sultan in the middle of the Crusades. He crossed enemy lines and tried to and spoke with the Sultan and tried to bring about actually ultimately his conversion, but nonetheless some type of a reconciliation. That he was again granted free travel to the Holy Land and came back. But a whole part of our one of our ministries is reconciliation, is confession. Friars are known to be one of our gifts we feel for the church are to be confessors, and that's a large part of healing that our ministry is geared to.
When you say confessor,
One who a priest would hear confessions. Uh, yeah, and say like Padre, even Padre Pio.
Padre Pio, I was gonna bring him up.
Padre Pio, our most famous Capuchin, one of our more famous Capuchins, uh, would spend hours a day in confessional and their reconciliation and being that an agent, a challenging agent. He was not an easy person to confess to. They would say one of his gifts is he could read your mind. He had the gift of reading souls, what was happening, and among his gifts. And his one was a line I like is if you go to confession more than 3 minutes, you need to go to confession more often.
Right.
Because your confession should not be terribly long or filled with lots of heaviness. But again, it's just the regular ordinary stuff that we don't do and that can allow the grace can help us to become more attentive to that and to be more the people we want from the grace of reconciliation. Most people I hear hearing confessions aren't mortal sinners.
No.
It's not grievous sin. It's so much sins against charity. The vast majority of sins we commit, and the fact that we just continue in our ways to put our agenda first and not allowing God's agenda to become ours for us. And that's part of, I would say, our Franciscan charism.
Seen you listed online as father. brother, pastor, and the reverend.
The reverend is just a general title, and anybody gets that. Now, when we're coming into father and brother, um, it's an interesting because there are Franciscans who are lay, we call them lay brothers. They're not ordained. We all take the same vows, take all vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and choosing um, not to be ordained, not to be sacramental ministers. So they're professors, they're nurses, they're social workers, young adult minister.
Do they live in the monasteries?
Yeah, we all live in one house. Yeah. So that sense of brother would be very much Francis's vision. And Francis was never a priest. St. Francis was a deacon. And he didn't even want to be a deacon, but he wanted to preach. So he had to be a deacon. He was ordained a deacon, but never a priest. And that whole sense that we are all, our basic identity is brother to one another. Our basic call is to the fraternity as brothers. And then the fraternity helps shape and discern how we serve. And the brothers used to be um, the true servants of the community. They made the sandals, they made the habits, they cooked, they did the physical tasks of maintaining a household. That's certainly radically changed in the last 40 years.
Are there many young men coming into the brotherhood?
Right now, we have 18 men who are studying to be friars in various processes. A lot like we will ordain 3 friars in June to the priesthood. Um, we have a number of men entering solemn vows, permanent vows, and studies in Washington. Uh, our novitiate, where I was, is in Santa Barbara, California, near Santa Barbara, and there are various stages of houses along the way. But we're blessed. We're blessed to have 18 men coming in, which is, and we have a young man who's a very dynamic vocation discerner, and we're hoping to build up our program at Borromeo Seminary in Wycliffe, where we have our college program. They go to John Carroll University, but they're in a college program.
I would always see that sign driving. It would say Telshi Yeshiva Bormeo. And I never knew what it was, you know?
Yeshiva it's an Orthodox Jewish seminary, at least right. There's on Bishop Road back there's a significant Orthodox community, Orthodox Jewish.
But they always had a sign on the freeway for that exit.
Yeah. We have a common boundary. The seminary and the both seminaries share a common boundary. Yeah.
This year, the Pope has declared this is the 800th anniversary for of the death of Saint Francis, and or so this is a jubilee year. What is a jubilee exactly?
It's meant to be a time of reconciliation, of healing, a special focus on either a particular devotion or a saint or purpose. I think it's 25 years, there was a biblical custom of having Jubilee, which was forgiveness of sin, forgiveness of debt, and a calling in a new way of being. We have a holy year every 25 years, which is something similar. But this year where we have a universal focus on the life of St. Francis, charism of our community, um, the way he can move and shape what values he holds in his teaching that can be very effective in our world. Probably was very, I think he sort of surprised us.
Right, yeah.
I know,
It did come out of nowhere, right?
we were talking about the other day, where did you find out? Oh, I saw it on Facebook. Or I saw it here. I saw it there. I saw it online. Is this something? Oh, you're doing this. We were very surprised by it. So, I mean, we are trying to figure out what we would like to do to celebrate it during the year and engage the community. Um, the diocese is putting out a separate plan on their own. I'm not really pretty sure what that's all about, but
Saint Francis is the saint for animals, right?
creation.
Creation.
He's a patron saint of ecology.
Right, but some of the non-Catholics, I guess, think that
Yeah.
has something to do with the animals.
Well, he did.
Yeah.
He did. He talked to birds because friars wouldn't listen to him. So
We talked to the
he
birds?
talked to the birds.
I talk to the birds now myself. Well, I read them every day at my office and at my house, and I'm so obsessed with it that I can't miss a day. Sometimes I drive downtown
just to
or
feed them.
before I come to your church, I'll go to the office and just so they get an extra feeding. Yeah. It's
They need it this time of year. But a lot he was attuned to finding the presence of God, and he found the presence as many, many people do. They may not find it in church, but they find it in creation. They find it walking through the woods. They find it at sunset at Edgewater.
I definitely have a genuine interest in trying to help people discover God now that I've made this. It's not a discovery. I knew God existed, but I didn't think he loved me. So now I know he loves me. And it's like I really want other people to get the opportunity to feel that as well. It's not even like, it's not because it's a requirement, but it's because I genuinely have the desire for other people to feel what I felt. And because it was so monumental to feel the love of God for the first time. For me personally, it was the first time I really felt love, period. So it was more than monumental. It wasn't just about God, it was about love, period. Didn't know it. And how do you think people, there are people out there that they're just on the fence. They don't really know what to do with God. They think they might believe, but they aren't sure if they want to make the commitment to all the extracurricular activities that they think they need to do to have God in their lives. You know, what could we say to encourage those folks really?
I think a lot of folks, there's a tremendous loneliness in the world today. Um, and it's also misconceptions. Is it what they think they need to do, or what the church really is, or I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, i.e., I want to make God in my image, rather than be crafted in the image of God. And it's just finding a community that works for the individual. Sometimes, and hopefully that for a Catholic, hopefully that is their parish community, but not everyone. And we're much looser about where we go to church, how do we work. Um, but it's so often finding the community where you feel welcomed, where you feel nourished, is that you're nourished, you're fed,
Yeah.
and that I always find it when someone wants to invite someone to come to St. Peter, because we are a non-traditional in format. We're a German parish. National parishes never had boundaries. So technically, we don't have any geographic boundaries like a parish. But is that something that I want? I want to share what I've felt and what I've experienced, and then that's when we know we've got them. Yeah, and but it's again, it's opening yourself up, being willing to um, explore the path, but it's also is doing it within the context of a faith-based community.
I think community is so important. I mean,
Our God is a community of persons. Everything that we do, we're like, "Oh, it's not good for man to be alone. I've got to make him a helpmate. I have to do this from the very, very beginning." And then that relationship with the stewardship of the garden, of creation, and all the things that our stories, our myths tell us about how we've come to understand that uh, myth is never a fairy tale. It's like it teaches us foundational truths, and those truths go from time into space. And those truths that we learn, Genesis may not be scientific, but the truths are so basic and unchanging. And that's where we draw all this information from. But it's always from the beginning, life has been lived in community, and the church is a wonder can be a wonderful place to find community.
yeah, no doubt.
And then the loneliness just doesn't seem to be dissipating. And we pull ourselves more into our podcasts and into our computers and into the privacy of like staring at a screen. Yeah, sometimes I feel sorry for young people because I see at the parish, the young adults that we have,
Yeah.
how they thrive and their lives have been changed by the members, the peers that they've met at church and experiencing church. They call them faith friends. That I never had faith friends until I came to St. Peter's. And I met this group of people that they are our best evangelizers. They are the guys who reach out, the young men and women who reach out and see a stranger at church and boom, they want to know your name. Here I want, and you're welcome. This is what we do, and you're welcome to join any of it that you want, but just keep coming back. Keep coming back.
Well, that's why the Protestants, my time in the Protestant church, the community is very close knit, once, but I had to actually get over my own inferiority complex in order to participate in that. Like this has to happen in order for this to be meaningful, and I've learned that, but also experience it. But we need both, you know? And so if you can't go here, get a community of people who maybe they are believers and you're not.
Yeah. Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, kinda.
That whole sense of that type of a spirituality, of forming that community and practicing to be this person that you want to be and actually coming to live it, but also acknowledging where I need to be forgiven, where I need to forgive others, where I need to forgive myself. And so often it's okay with others, but it can be very hard to forgive myself of the things that I've done or my motivations, what's led me to do X, Y, and Z. And when you can't really forgive others until you forgive yourself and experience that self uh, purging, if you will, or reconciliation.
Well, that's what makes so many of the Bible stories so wonderful and beautiful in the sense of like I can relate to almost all of the stories in the Bible in one way or another. And so, you know, like I'm a Psalm 23 fanatic. I love that psalm. It fills me with joy to spend time with that psalm. And I know what David did, and yet he could have that experience with God that would allow him to write that psalm, and yet what he did with Bathsheba, and so I can kind of the Bible helped me to relieve the condemnation I had for myself, to the self-hatred because I thought I was a bad person, but we're all bad.
There's no sin that God will not forgive.
No, and he knows everyone.
But there's nothing that God is unforgivable. And that hope, like Paul says, that hope does not disappoint. And that hope never disappoints because the love of God has been poured into our hearts. And yes. And that by that forgiveness that we receive and acknowledge, wow, I'm not the person I thought I was. And I'm not the person I can be.
And I'm not the person that he fearfully and wonderfully made me to be, right?
And I'm continuing on that journey.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in my early times with scripture. I spent a lot of time with John 3:16 and Romans 3:23, which is for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. So it's like God loved me so much, he sent his son who took away my sins and made me whole and holy and righteous and good in God's eyes. And those two sections alone were a huge beginning for me because I just had to believe that God loved me because he loves everyone. And then I had to sort of believe that my sins were forgiven. But I have the opportunity to do good things now.
Right. And to enjoy them, and they're not
Yeah.
for me, they're for others, and but I still receive the joy
Yeah.
in the midst of all of it.
Yeah. So, love your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to close up with?
Stop by the Friar's table.
Oh, come to the
The
Friar's Table
Frank,
for sure.
cheap commercial here. We're closed on Monday. We'll open for dinner Tuesday through Sunday from 4 o'clock till 8 o'clock.
How often will we see you here?
As often as I can be here, because um, this is one of the few things I have my fingers in.
So this is the pilot episode, the first episode. Hopefully, we'll be able to do this some more.
We'll see what, yeah.
I'd like to try to figure that out. I really think there's an opportunity. I mean, any opportunity to sit down and explore God and love and fellowship
And food.
and food, I think is a pretty wonderful opportunity.